The cornbread had been perfect that morning, golden brown with honey drizzled across its surface, still warm from the cast-iron skillet. James had eaten 3 pieces, while little kicks from their unborn children made Sarah's belly dance beneath her calico dress. He'd laughed at the movement, pressing his work-roughened hands against the swell of new life. 3 babies. He'd marveled, his blue eyes bright with wonder. Lord knows we'll have our hands full, but think of the laughter this house will hold. The memory dissolved as consciousness clawed its way back through layers of agony. The sand tasted of blood and broken dreams now. Sarah Mitchell's cracked lips pressed against gritty earth as reality crashed over her like a cold wave. Her left arm was pinned beneath a collapsed beam, the wood pressing deep grooves into flesh already purple with bruising. Each breath sent fire through her ribs, at least 2 broken, maybe 3. But it was the silence that terrified her most. Where were her babies? She tried to call out, but only a rasp emerged from her throat. Sand filled her mouth, her nostrils ground between her teeth like powdered glass. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed into something alien and hostile. What had once been her modest homestead, the place where James had promised they'd grow old together, was now a landscape of dunes and debris, as if God himself had shaken the earth like a snow globe and let the pieces settle where they may. A weak cry pierced the desert silence. Then another, fainter still. Sarah's maternal instincts overrode her body's protests. She wrenched her arm free with a scream that sent turkey vultures wheeling overhead, their shadows like dark omens against the merciless sun. Blood ran from where splinters had torn her skin, but she crawled forward on her belly, following the sound. 10 feet. 20. Each movement sent waves of agony through her broken ribs, but she pressed on. Driven by love, stronger than death itself. There, beneath an overturned water trough, a flash of white cotton. Her baby's swaddling clothes, somehow still intact. Sarah's heart hammered against her damaged ribs. As she lifted the wooden trough with strength she didn't know she possessed, adrenaline and desperation, fusing into something beyond human limitation. 3 tiny faces looked up at her, their skin blue-tinged with cold. Mary, the smallest, wasn't moving. Thomas whimpered softly, his breathing shallow and rapid. Little James, named for his dead father, stared at her with eyes too knowing for an infant, as if he understood that their world had ended in the space of one terrible night. Sarah gathered them against her chest, her tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on her cheeks. They had survived the night, but barely. Without shelter, without water, without food, they would not survive another day. The nearest town was 15 miles through desert that had claimed stronger men than she, men with horses and guns and experience of the frontier's cruelties. As she held her children close, Sarah's gaze fell upon something that made her blood turn to ice water. Boot prints in the sand, fresh ones, leading away from where her house had stood. The prints were deep, made by someone heavy, moving with purpose rather than panic. Someone had been here during the storm. Someone had seen her plight and left her to die, or someone was still watching. Sarah Mitchell had been many things in her 28 years: schoolteacher, pioneer wife, expectant mother, full of hope for the future. But as she crouched in the ruins of her life, with 3 dying infants in her arms, she discovered what she truly was, beneath the veneer of civilization, a woman with nothing left to lose, which made her the most dangerous creature in all of Texas. The memory of that perfect morning seemed like something from another lifetime now. James's laughter, the promise of shared tomorrows, the simple joy of cornbread and honey, all of it swept away by the storm that had torn through their lives, like the wrath of an angry God. But even as despair threatened to drown her, Sarah felt something else kindling in the ashes of her heart, rage pure and focused as a blade. Someone would pay for this. Someone would answer for what had been done to her family. But first she had to keep her babies alive. The sun climbed higher, turning the desert into a furnace. Sarah forced herself to her feet, swaying with exhaustion and pain. and began to assess her situation with the methodical thinking that had made her a good teacher. Water, she needed water first. Food could wait, but without water, they'd all be dead by nightfall. To the west, she could make out a line of darker rock where the caprock began. There might be caves there, shelter from the sun that was already beginning to scorch the air. More importantly, where there were caves, there might be springs, hidden sources of water that had sustained travelers and fugitives for generations. She fashioned a sling from her torn skirt, securing the babies against her body with strips of fabric. Every step sent agony through her broken ribs, but she set off across the sand, following game trails that might lead to water. The turkey vultures followed overhead, patient as undertakers. That's when she saw the riders coming. 3 men on horseback moving fast across the flats with the purposeful urgency of hunters closing on wounded prey. Even at a distance, Sarah recognized the lead rider's expensive hat, his soft posture in the saddle. Willard Gant had come to survey the results of his handiwork, and finding her alive would complicate his plans considerably. Sarah looked around desperately for cover, but the storm had scoured the landscape clean. No trees, no rocks, nowhere to hide from the eyes of men who knew this country better than she did. The riders would see her within minutes, and in her condition, she couldn't outrun a determined tortoise. That's when she heard the voice, low, careful, speaking English, with the precise cadence of someone for whom it was a second language. This way, quickly. Sarah spun around, nearly losing her balance, her heart hammering against her damaged ribs. A man stood 20 feet away, so still she might have mistaken him for a rock formation if he hadn't spoken. He was tall and lean, with dark skin weathered by sun and wind-long black hair tied back with strips of leather. He wore buckskin clothing that seemed to blend with the landscape itself, and his face was painted with ochre and charcoal in patterns that spoke of ceremonies older than memory. A Comanche warrior. She should have been terrified. Every story she'd heard about Indians involved rape, murder, and babies stolen in the night. But his eyes, dark and sad and strangely gentle, told a different story entirely. "They come for you," he said, his English careful but clear. "You come with me or you die here with your little ones." Behind her, the sound of hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by Gant's voice calling orders to his men. Sarah looked at the Comanche warrior, then at her dying children, then back at the approaching riders who represented everything she had learned to fear about the world. The warrior extended his hand, scarred from old battles, steady as stone. "Choose now." Sarah took his hand. He led her to what appeared to be solid ground, but when he knelt and brushed away sand, she saw it was actually a clever disguise over a natural depression. They dropped down into a hidden arroyo, just as the riders crested the nearest hill, their horses' hooves drumming against hardpan like distant thunder. Sarah pressed herself against the sandy wall, her babies mercifully quiet, as Gant's voice drifted down from above like smoke from a distant fire. "Tracks lead this way, but the wind's been working on them." Gant's tone was conversational, almost pleasant, the voice of a man discussing the weather. "Could be animal sign, could be our missing lady. Maybe the storm got her after all, boss." This voice was rougher, tinged with the accent of the deep south. "Would save us some trouble, wouldn't it? Maybe." Gant's reply carried the patient amusement of a cat, toying with a wounded mouse. "But I want to be certain. You boys spread out, check every gully, every rock pile. If she's alive, I want her found. If she's dead, I want proof. Either way, those babies are worth their weight in gold to the right buyers." For 20 minutes, that felt like hours, Sarah held her breath as the searchers combed the area above. The Comanche warrior crouched beside her, motionless as carved stone, his dark eyes never leaving the rim of the arroyo. His stillness was complete, not just the absence of movement, but the presence of perfect control, like a mountain lion waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Finally, the sound of horses moved away, fading into the distance like a retreating storm. But the warrior didn't relax immediately. He waited, listening to sounds Sarah couldn't hear, reading signs written in languages she'd never learned. "They will return," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "With more men, better trackers. We must go far from here." Sarah studied his face, looking for deception, for hidden motives, for the savagery she'd been taught to expect from his people. But all she saw was a man who understood what it meant to be hunted, to have precious things threatened by those with more power and less conscience. "Why are you helping me?" Something flickered across his features, pain, old and deep as canyon carved by centuries of wind and water. "I know the sound of children crying." He set his eyes distant with memory. "I know what it means when that sound stops forever." He turned away, but not before Sarah saw the grief that lived behind his eyes, like a caged animal. This man had lost children of his own, had heard their cries fade into silence that would last until the end of the world. "What's your name?" she asked softly. "Tabe. It means rock in the language of my people." "What are you called?" "Sarah. Sarah Mitchell. And these are Mary Thomas and James." Tabe nodded gravely, as if being formally introduced to visiting dignitaries rather than dying infants in the middle of nowhere. "The little ones are weak," he observed with the clinical eye of someone who had seen death many times. "They need water, food, warmth. There is a place where these things can be found, but it is far." "How far?" He looked at her torn dress, her obvious injuries, the way she favored her left side, where the beam had crushed her ribs. 2 days' walk for a strong man. For you with the babies." He paused, considering. "Perhaps we should find another way." Sarah straightened, despite the pain drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known existed. "I'll make it. Whatever it takes, I'll make it." Tabe studied her for a long moment, his dark eyes seeming to weigh her soul. "Yes," he said finally. "I think perhaps you will." They traveled by night and hid by day, moving through landscape that belonged more to dreams than the waking world. Tabe knew every rock, every hidden spring, every cave that could offer shelter from the merciless sun. He showed Sarah which cacti could be cut open for their moisture, which insects were edible, how to find direction by the stars when the moon was dark as the heart of winter. More importantly, he knew how to care for sick babies with the skill of someone who had raised children of his own. When Mary's breathing became labored, he mixed a paste from certain roots and berries, rubbing it on her chest with gentle fingers until she breathed easier. When Thomas developed a fever, Tabe found clay of a particular reddish color and made a poultice that drew the heat from the child's tiny body. His hands were gentle as a woman's, his knowledge vast as the sky above them. Sarah found herself trusting him with her most precious possessions, not just the babies, but her hopes, her fears, her desperate need to believe that somewhere in this hostile world, kindness still existed. On the second night, as they sheltered in a shallow cave, while a dust storm raged outside like the breath of angry spirits, Sarah finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind. "Where are we going?" Tabe was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible above the wind that howled through the rocks like mourning voices. "To my people, but I do not know if they will accept you." "Why not?" "Because you are white. Because bringing you to them may bring soldiers, and soldiers bring death. Because..." He paused, staring into the small fire he'd built from wood, dry as bone. "Because I am not welcome there myself." Sarah shifted the babies to her other arm, wincing as the movement pulled at her broken ribs. "What did you do?" Tabe's jaw worked silently for a moment, as if the words were too heavy for his tongue to lift. "I lived when my family died. Some think this is shameful." The story came out slowly, painfully, like drawing splinters from an infected wound. Tabe had been a war chief, with a wife named Ayanna, Eternal Blossom, and 2 young sons, Kohana and Dakota. They'd been camped near a river when soldiers came in the night, not regular army, but militia drunk on whiskey and bloodlust, and the kind of hatred that turns men into monsters. Tabe had been hunting, tracking an elk that would have fed his family for weeks. When he returned at dawn, he found his world transformed into a charnel house. Ayanna had died trying to protect their sons. The boys 8 and 6 years old had been killed with the casual brutality reserved for vermin. I tracked the men who did this. He said, his voice as cold as winter wind through dead trees. I found them. He stopped, his hands clenching into fists. But it did not bring them back. Nothing brings them back. Sarah understood then why his eyes held such sadness, why he'd risked everything to help her. He was trying to save children. He couldn't save protecting a family that existed only in the echoing chambers of memory. I'm sorry. She said the words inadequate as prayers in a burning church. The white men who killed them wore the same blue coats as the soldiers who hunt my people now. But you. He looked at her then, at the babies sleeping peacefully in her arms. You are just a mother like she was. And these little ones, they have done nothing to deserve hatred. Outside, the storm gradually subsided, leaving behind the profound silence that follows great violence. Sarah watched Tabe's face in the firelight, seeing not the savage of frontier nightmares, but a man hollowed out by loss, trying to fill the emptiness with acts of mercy. Your people will understand, she said with more confidence than she felt. Parents are the same everywhere. Tabe smiled, an expression sadder than tears. We will see. They reached the Comanche camp at dawn on the third day, emerging from a maze of red rock canyons that seemed to exist in a world apart from the one Sarah had known. The settlement was smaller than she'd expected, perhaps 50 people total, hidden in a box canyon that couldn't be seen from any direction until you were almost on top of it. The entrance was so narrow that 2 people could barely walk side by side. But once inside, the canyon opened up into a hidden valley, carpeted with grass of the color of jade. Ancient cottonwoods shaded a clear stream that ran down the center like a silver thread, and painted teepees dotted the meadow like flowers after rain. The reception was not warm. Women grabbed children and pulled them away from the white stranger. Men reached for weapons, bows, lances, knives that gleamed like frozen lightning. An old warrior with scars covering his chest like a map of ancient battles stepped forward, speaking rapid Comanche in tones that needed no translation. He was angry, possibly murderous, and he wanted explanations that might be paid for in blood. Tabe answered calmly, his hands empty, and visible, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone accustomed to being questioned. The conversation grew heated with more voices joining in. Sarah caught fragments that sounded like white eyes and soldiers and death. She held her babies closer, acutely aware that she was surrounded by people who had every reason to hate her, every justification for seeing her as an enemy. Finally, an ancient woman pushed through the crowd like a ship cutting through troubled waters. She was tiny, barely reaching Sarah's shoulder, but something about her presence made everyone step back, as if she were a force of nature given human form. Her hair was white as fresh snow, her face mapped with wrinkles that spoke of wisdom earned through decades of joy and sorrow. But her eyes were sharp as obsidian knives. She studied Sarah for a long moment with the thorough attention of a scholar, examining a rare manuscript, then looked at the babies with the same intensity. When little James started to cry, thin, desperate wails that cut through the morning air like broken glass, she extended her arms without hesitation. Sarah hesitated, every instinct screaming warnings about giving her child to a stranger. But something in the old woman's eyes, a depth of compassion that transcended race and language, made her carefully place the infant in those weathered but gentle hands. The woman examined the baby with the thorough attention of an expert, checking his breathing, the color of his skin, the alertness of his eyes. She spoke a few words in Comanche, her voice carrying authority that silenced all other conversation. And Tabe translated with obvious relief. Grandmother Sakima says your children are strong, but they need care only women can give. She asks why you have brought them here so far from your own people. Sarah looked around at the circle of faces, some hostile, some curious, awaiting for her answer. Because they're hunting us, she said simply. Because they want to take my children and sell them to people who collect babies like trinkets. because I had nowhere else to go, and this man," she gestured to Tabe, "showed me kindness when the world had shown me only cruelty." Tabe translated her words, his voice carrying their weight like precious cargo. Grandmother Sakima listened, then spoke again, at greater length, her tone shifting from inquiry to something that sounded like prophecy. "She says the white soldiers have taken many of our children." Tabe translated, "sold them to schools far away, where they are taught to forget their people, their language, their very souls. She says perhaps it is time for whites to know this feeling, to understand what it means to have precious things stolen by those with power but no conscience." The crowd murmured agreement. But Grandmother Sakima wasn't finished. She handed James back to Sarah with the careful reverence reserved for sacred objects, then walked to the edge of the stream. She knelt slowly, making the movement deliberate, and cupped water in her hands, studying it, as if reading signs written in its flow by spirits older than memory. When she stood, her expression had changed completely. She spoke rapidly to the assembled people, her voice carrying an authority that silenced all arguments, even from the scarred war chief who had seemed ready to spill blood moments before. "What did she say?" Sarah whispered to Tabe. "She says the water told her of 3 stars falling from the storm sky." He replied, wonder creeping into his voice. "She says this was foretold by her grandmother's grandmother, that when the white stars fell to earth, they would bring great change to our people. Good change or bad change, that remains to be seen." Sarah looked down at her 3 babies, understanding the metaphor with crystal clarity. "So they'll let us stay, for now. But Grandmother Sakima has also seen something else in the water, something that troubles her greatly." Tabe's expression darkened like clouds gathering before a storm. "She says the men who hunt you will not give up easily. She says they will bring great danger to our people, and the price of protecting you may be paid in blood." As if summoned by his words, a young warrior came running into the canyon, his paint horse lathered with sweat and foam. He spoke urgently to the scarred war chief, pointing back the way he'd come with gestures sharp as thrown spears. Tabe's face went rigid as stone. "Soldiers," he said quietly. "A full company with a soft white man leading them. They are asking questions in the settlements, offering gold for information about a missing white woman and her children." Sarah's heart sank like a stone thrown into deep water. She'd brought death to these people, who'd shown her kindness, endangered families, who had already lost so much to white violence. "I have to leave," she said, already turning toward the canyon entrance. "I won't let them suffer because of me." But Grandmother Sakima caught her arm with surprising strength, shaking her head firmly. She spoke to Tabe, who translated reluctantly, as if the words carried weight he didn't want to bear. "She says the stars have fallen, and they cannot be made to rise again. What will be, will be. But she also says—" He paused, frowning. "She says one of the soldiers carries great pain, and that pain may be the key to everything." Sarah didn't understand what that meant, but there was no time to ask questions. The war chief was already organizing defenses, posting sentries with names like Red Hawk and Stone Bear, preparing for a siege that might come with the next sunrise. That night, as Sarah fed her babies with milk, provided by Comanche mothers whose own children had been stolen by soldiers, she tried to make sense of her situation. 3 days ago, she'd been a dying woman, with dying children abandoned in the desert, by men who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to profit. Now she was surrounded by people who'd welcomed her, despite every reason to turn her away. It didn't feel real. It felt like a dream, the kind where you know you're going to wake up back in the nightmare you've been trying to escape. But as she watched Comanche children playing by the stream, their laughter bright as coins thrown into sunlight, Sarah allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where her babies could grow up safe. She was still harboring that fragile hope when the attack came. No warning shots, no demands for surrender, no chance for negotiation or peaceful resolution. Just the thunder of hooves, and the crash of rifles as soldiers poured through the narrow canyon entrance like water through a broken dam. Their battle cries echoing off the walls like the screams of hunting eagles. Sarah barely had time to grab her babies before the world exploded into chaos. Comanche warriors met the attack with desperate courage, but they were outnumbered 3-1 and outgunned by enemies armed with repeating rifles and military discipline. Women and children scattered like startled birds, seeking shelter among the rocks, while bullets whined overhead like angry hornets. Sarah found herself pressed against the canyon wall, clutching her infants, while men died all around her. The morning air filled with smoke and screaming the metallic smell of blood, mixing with gunpowder to create an atmosphere that belonged in hell itself. Through the chaos, she saw him, Captain Marcus Harper, riding at the head of his column like some dark angel of judgment. He was everything Gant was not: tall, lean, hard as leather, and twice as tough. His uniform was faded but immaculate, his movements efficient and deadly. This was a man who'd seen action in a dozen forgotten wars, who'd made killing into an art form practiced with grim dedication. But there was something else about him, something in his eyes that reminded Sarah of Tabe, a kind of focused pain, as if he were trying to outrun demons that always stayed one step ahead of his horse. Behind Harper rode Gant, his soft face flushed with excitement, shouting orders and directions like a man at a turkey shoot. But it was the third man who made Sarah's blood freeze in her veins, a lean figure in buckskin and war paint, riding with the soldiers as if he belonged among them. Red Hawk. The same warrior who'd been posted as a sentry, who'd eaten at the communal fire the night before, who'd played with Comanche children as if they were his own. Now he was guiding soldiers to the hidden places where families cowered in terror, pointing out defensive positions with the casual efficiency of betrayal. The battle was over in minutes. How could it be otherwise when one side had modern weapons and advanced intelligence, while the other had only courage and desperation? The Comanche fought bravely, but bravery doesn't stop bullets fired by men who sleep soundly after slaughter. When the shooting stopped, Captain Harper was standing over Grandmother Sakima's body, his smoking rifle still in his hands. The old woman had died trying to shield 2 young children, not her own blood, but orphans the tribe had taken in and loved as family. Her white hair was spread around her head like snow, and her ancient eyes stared sightlessly at the sky she'd read for omens that had come to pass in blood and fire. Sarah felt something break inside her chest, not her ribs, though those were already broken, but something deeper that had been holding her together since James died. The woman who'd welcomed her, who'd seen prophecy in 3 abandoned babies, was dead because Sarah had brought soldiers to her door. The weight of that guilt would crush mountains. Captain Harper turned away from the body, scanning the canyon for survivors with the methodical attention of a man accustomed to counting the dead. His gaze found Sarah almost immediately, and she saw recognition flicker across his weathered features. Mrs. Sarah Mitchell. His voice was surprisingly cultured, with just a trace of southern accent softened by years of shouting commands over battlefield noise. "Ma'am, I'm Captain Marcus Harper, United States Army. Mr. Gant here tells me you've been taken captive by hostiles." Sarah looked around at the scattered bodies, at the women weeping over dead husbands and sons, at Tabe lying motionless near the stream, with blood pooling under his head like spilled wine. "No." The word came out as a whisper, sharp as broken glass. "Yes, ma'am. Terrible thing what these savages do to white women and children. But you're safe now. We'll escort you back to town, get you proper medical attention, see that you're cared for according to Christian principles." Gant pushed forward, his eyes fixed on the babies in Sarah's arms, with the hungry intensity of a man examining merchandise. "Thank God you're alive, Mrs. Mitchell," he said, his voice oily with false concern. "When we found your homestead buried under sand, we feared the worst. But here you are, and the children too, all 3 of them healthy and whole. Truly miraculous." Sarah looked at him, really looked and understood with sudden perfect clarity that this had never been about debt or land or even her body. This had always been about her children. 3 healthy white babies were worth a fortune to the right buyers, and Gant had orchestrated everything, the storm, the debt, the massacre, to get his hands on them legally. "You planned this," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the canyon like the whisper of wind through graves. "All of it." Gant's smile was all teeth and no warmth, the expression of a predator who no longer needed to hide his nature. "Planned what, my dear? I'm simply a concerned citizen trying to help a neighbor in distress. Captain Harper can explain the situation better than I can." Harper stepped closer, and Sarah caught the smell of whiskey on his breath, despite the early-hour liquid courage or liquid guilt, impossible to tell which. "Mrs. Mitchell, I need to ask you some questions about your time with these Indians. Did they harm you in any way, interfere with you, force themselves upon you?" Sarah understood what he was really asking. If she claimed rape, it would justify the massacre in the eyes of any military tribunal. If she admitted the Comanche had helped her, it would complicate Gant's narrative and raise uncomfortable questions about why soldiers had slaughtered peaceful families. "They saved my life," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the blood-soaked canyon. "They saved my children's lives. They showed me more kindness in 3 days than civilized white men have shown in 3 years. Harper's expression hardened like cooling iron. "Ma'am, I understand you've been through an ordeal that would break lesser women. Sometimes captives develop sympathies for their captors. It's natural, a way of surviving unthinkable circumstances. But you need to understand that these people are dangerous. They've been raiding settlements, killing innocent families, stealing children to raise as their own savage spawn. Like you just did." The words were out before Sarah could stop them, hanging in the air, like smoke from a discharged rifle. Harper's face went white, then red, color rising like blood in water. His hand moved to his sidearm with practiced efficiency. "Oh, ma'am, I'd advise you to be very careful about the accusations you make. We're here under lawful orders to rescue a kidnapped white woman and her children. What happened here was necessary to secure your safety and the safety of other settlers who might fall victim to these savages." Gant placed a restraining hand on Harper's arm, playing the role of peacemaker, while his eyes calculated profit margins. "Now, Captain, Mrs. Mitchell is obviously distraught, suffering from hysteria brought on by terrible trauma. Perhaps we should get her back to town, where she can receive proper care from qualified physicians." But Harper wasn't listening to Gant anymore. He was staring at something on the ground near Grandmother Sakima's body, a small leather pouch that had spilled open when she fell, scattering its contents across sand already dark with blood. Among the scattered objects were things that had no place in a Comanche camp. A child's wooden horse, a rag doll with yellow yarn hair, and a small silver locket that caught the morning light like a fallen star. Harper knelt and picked up the locket with hands that trembled like leaves in a high wind. He opened it with the careful reverence of a man handling something infinitely precious. And Sarah saw his face crumble like a dam giving way to flood waters. "Emily." The name came out as a broken whisper, softer than wind through dry grass. "Emily, my baby girl." The locket contained a tiny photograph. A little blonde girl, maybe 4 years old, with Harper's steel-gray eyes and a smile bright as sunshine after rain. Sarah understood immediately. This was his daughter, lost to Indian raids years ago, and somehow Grandmother Sakima had been carrying her memory like a sacred trust. Harper looked around the canyon as if seeing it for the first time, really seeing the scattered toys, the children's clothes, the careful arrangements that spoke of love rather than savagery. Bodies everywhere, blood soaking into sand, the smell of gunpowder and death hanging in the air like incense in a desecrated church. "She was here," he said to no one in particular, his voice hollow as wind through empty rooms. "My Emily was here in this place." Tabe stirred beside the stream. Not dead after all, though blood ran freely from a gash across his forehead where a rifle butt had opened his scalp to the bone. He sat up slowly, his dark eyes finding Harper with the patient attention of someone who had always known this moment would come. "Your daughter," he said in careful English, each word chosen with the precision of prayer. "Yellow hair who laughs. We found her after the soldiers came to our old camp. She was broken inside like a bird with torn wings. Grandmother Sakima tried to heal her spirit, but some wounds are too deep for even the strongest medicine." Harper raised his rifle, pointing it at Tabe's chest, with hands that shook like aspen leaves in autumn wind. "What did you do to her?" The words came out as a roar of anguish. "What did you animals do to my little girl?" "We gave her love." Tabe replied quietly, meeting Harper's eyes without flinching. "We gave her a family, a place to belong, when the world had shown her only violence. We gave her 2 more years of life before the coughing sickness took her. She died in Grandmother Sakima's arms, speaking your name with her last breath." The rifle trembled in Harper's hands like a compass needle seeking true north. "You're lying. The Indians killed her. The report said she was murdered with the rest of my family. The report said..." The report was wrong. Tabe interrupted gently. "She lived. She learned our ways, spoke our language, drew pictures of a man in blue coat who sang to her at night. Grandmother Sakima kept her things to honor her memory, as we honor all children who have crossed to the spirit world." Sarah watched Harper's world collapse in real-time truth, demolishing the foundations of everything he'd believed for years. Everything that had driven him to become a killer of Indians, the rage and grief that had fueled his service to men like Gant, was built on a lie. His daughter had died surrounded by love, not violence, and he'd just slaughtered the people who'd cared for her as if she were their own blood. Red Hawk chose that moment to speak up, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who thought he held all the cards. "Enough talk of dead children," he said in accented English, addressing Harper with casual familiarity. "You have what you came for, the woman and her babies. Give me my payment, and we can finish this business." Sarah stared at him in horror, understanding finally how the soldiers had found their hidden refuge. Red Hawk hadn't been captured or coerced. He'd been bought, his loyalty sold for whatever price Gant was willing to pay for Comanche children delivered into slavery. Harper turned slowly to face the traitor, his expression unreadable. "Payment. $50 for each living child as agreed." Red Hawk continued, apparently oblivious to the dangerous shift in Harper's mood. "Plus, the bonus for the woman. These white babies will bring good money from the buyers in New Orleans." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Gant's face went white as chalk, and he began backing away from Harper with the careful movements of a man who suddenly realizes he's standing on the edge of a cliff. "Captain, I can explain." But Harper was beyond explanations. The truth was written in Red Hawk's casual greed, in Gant's panic, in the scattered evidence of a child-stealing operation that had used his command as cover for years of atrocities. How many raids had he led based on false intelligence? How many families had he destroyed to line criminals' pockets? Red Hawk, sensing the shift in atmosphere, reached for his weapon. But Harper was faster than regret, his service revolver clearing leather with practiced speed. The shot echoed off canyon walls like thunder, and Red Hawk crumpled to the ground with a look of genuine surprise on his painted face. "That's for every child you sold," Harper said quietly, smoke still curling from his gun barrel. "And for mine." Gant's mask finally slipped, completely revealing the predator beneath layers of civilized pretense. "What does it matter?" He snarled, his cultured accent giving way to something uglier. "They're just Indians, barely human. And this woman, she's nobody, nothing. Her husband was a failure, she's drowning in debt. And those babies will die of neglect if left in her care. I'm providing a service meeting demand with supply." Harper's revolver swung toward Gant, but the banker was faster than he looked. A derringer appeared in his hand, a lady's gun, small and easily concealed but deadly at close range. "I don't think so, Captain. You're going to escort Mrs. Mitchell and her children back to town, where arrangements have already been made for their care." The children will find loving homes with wealthy families. The woman will meet with an unfortunate accident, and everyone will blame the Indians. Clean, simple, profitable. Sarah clutched her babies closer, her mind racing through possibilities that all seemed to end in tragedy. She was trapped between a murderous banker and a guilt-ridden soldier, surrounded by the bodies of people who died protecting her. There had to be a way out, some solution that didn't end with her children being sold like livestock in a market square. That's when Tabe moved with a deadly grace that had made him a war chief. Despite his injuries, despite being surrounded by enemies, the Comanche warrior still had fight left in him. He rolled sideways, scooped up a fallen soldier's rifle, and put a bullet through Gant's wrist before anyone could react. The derringer went flying, and Gant screamed like a wounded animal, clutching his shattered arm while blood poured between his fingers. But Tabe wasn't finished. A thrown knife took down the nearest soldier, while his rifle accounted for another. The remaining troopers sought cover, suddenly outnumbered by an enemy who knew every rock and shadow in the canyon. What had seemed like easy cleanup operation had transformed into a deadly game of cat and mouse, with the mouse showing unexpected teeth. Sarah found herself pressed against the canyon wall again. But this time, Tabe was beside her, blood still streaming from his head wound, but his eyes clear and determined as winter sky. "There is another way out," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the sound of scattered gunfire. "Up the cliff face, a path only children and desperate people can climb. But with the babies, I'll make it work," Sarah said with more confidence than she felt. "Just show me the way." Harper appeared around a boulder, his rifle trained on them both. But instead of shooting, he did something that shocked everyone present. He lowered his weapon and stepped between Sarah and his own men. "Mrs. Mitchell, take your children and go. I'll hold them here as long as I can." Sarah stared at him in confusion. Why would you help us?" "Because I've killed enough innocents for one lifetime," he said, his voice heavy with years of accumulated guilt. "Because your babies deserve better than Gant's buyers. Because—" He looked down at the locket still clutched in his free hand. "Because Emily would want me to save them. Maybe that's the only redemption I'm ever going to find." A bullet whined off the rock near Harper's head, reminding everyone that philosophical conversations were a luxury they couldn't afford. Gant, his wounded arm bound with a strip of cloth torn from his expensive shirt, had taken command of the remaining soldiers with the desperate authority of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Leave no one alive," he barked, eyes wild with rage. "I don't care if it's the native, the woman, or the children. End it now, before anyone talks." But Harper had already made his choice. He turned his rifle on his own men, putting himself between Sarah and soldiers who'd served under him for years. "Stand down," he bellowed with the voice of absolute command, honed by years of battlefield leadership. "Anyone who fires on civilians will answer to me personally." The soldiers hesitated, torn between conflicting orders from their captain and a civilian who'd been paying their unofficial bonuses. It was the opening Tabe had been waiting for. "Now," he said urgently. "Go now while they are confused." Sarah looked back once as Tabe led her toward the hidden trail that climbed the canyon wall like a ladder to heaven. Harper was still standing guard over Grandmother Sakima's body, his rifle ready, his face set with grim determination. He'd found his redemption in protecting the children of strangers, but it would almost certainly cost him his life. The climb was a nightmare of loose rock, and sheer drops made worse by Sarah's injuries and the need to protect 3 infants who had no understanding of the danger they faced. Tabe went first, testing each handhold, calling back warnings about unstable sections that might give way under the weight of desperate people. Halfway up, little Mary started crying, thin, desperate wails that seemed to echo off every canyon wall. Sarah tried to quiet her, but the infant was beyond comfort, her tiny body burning with fever that spoke of infection or worse. "She's dying." Sarah whispered to Tabe, the words torn from her heart like chunks of flesh. "I can't save her." Tabe looked back at the baby with eyes that had seen too much death, too much loss, too many children who couldn't be saved despite all the love in the world. "Then we honor her passing," he said gently, "but we do not stop climbing." The words were harsh but necessary. Below them, shouts echoed through the canyon as Gant's men searched for their escape route. There was no time to grieve, no opportunity for proper farewells. They could only climb and hope and carry their burdens toward whatever waited at the top of the world. Mary died as they reached the canyon rim. Her last breath, a tiny sigh that barely disturbed the morning air. Sarah felt the moment of passing, the subtle change in weight, the stillness that meant her daughter was gone forever. Claimed by a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty from the moment of her birth. But there was no time to process the loss. No luxury of grief for those still fighting to survive. Behind them, soldiers were already beginning the climb, and their rifle shots chipping rock dangerously close to Sarah's head. Tabe pulled her away from the edge, deeper into the maze of stone formations that crowned the canyon like ancient monuments to forgotten gods. They ran through landscapes that belonged in fever dreams, twisted spires of red rock, natural bridges spanning impossible gaps, hidden pools of water that reflected the sky like mirrors crafted by spirits. Tabe knew every trail, every shortcut, every place where pursuing horses couldn't follow. But he was weakening. The head wound had reopened during the climb, and blood loss was taking its toll on even his iron constitution. His steps grew unsteady, his breathing labored, his usually perfect balance compromised by injury and exhaustion. When he finally collapsed beside a small spring hidden among the rocks, Sarah knew they couldn't run any farther. "Leave me." He gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "Take the children and go. There is a settlement 2 days north, good people who will help." Sarah knelt beside him, checking the severity of his wounds, with hands that had learned too much about injury and death in recent days. "I'm not leaving you. Not after everything you've done for us. You must. The babies need their mother alive, and I am finished. My family waits for me in the spirit world. The babies need their mother alive." Sarah agreed. "And I need help keeping them that way. We stay together or we die together. Those are the only choices I'm offering." She tore strips from her already tattered dress, binding Tabe's head wound as best she could, with materials that belonged in a hospital rather than a desperate battlefield surgery. He protested weakly, but his protests grew fainter as she worked, until finally he was unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady as a whispered prayer. Sarah looked around their refuge with the calculating eye of someone who'd learned that survival demanded constant vigilance. It was a box canyon within a box canyon, accessible only through a narrow crack in the rock face that could be defended by a single person with sufficient motivation. Water, shelter, and defensive positions, they could hold out here for days, if necessary. But did they have days? Thomas was developing the same fever that had killed Mary, and little James was far too quiet for a healthy infant. Without proper medicine, she would lose them all, and then Gant's victory would be complete. That night, as Sarah kept vigil over her unconscious protector and dying children, she heard something that made her blood run cold as mountain snow, on the sound of approaching horses moving slowly and carefully through the maze of stone, like hunters tracking wounded prey. Gant had found them. Sarah peered through a crack in the rocks and saw them 5 men on horseback, led by Gant himself despite his wounded arm. They moved with the patience of professional hunters, checking every possible hiding place, following signs invisible to untrained eyes. Behind them on foot came more men. Sarah recognized some of them from town: the saloon keeper, who'd always been polite to her face, the deputy sheriff, who tipped his hat when they met on the street, even the preacher's eldest son, who taught Sunday school to children, like the ones Gant was trying to steal. Gant had assembled a posse by promising rewards for the rescue of kidnapped children, turning neighbors into accomplices with the simple application of greed and racial hatred. They would find the hidden canyon within hours. When they did, Sarah would have no choice but to surrender or watch her children die slowly of neglect and fever. Tabe was unconscious. She was alone with 2 dying babies. And there was nowhere left to run in a world that seemed determined to destroy everything she loved. Unless Sarah looked down at Tabe's weapons, a rifle, a pistol, and a knife, with a bone handle worn smooth by years of use. She'd never killed anyone, barely knew how to load a gun properly, but desperation was teaching her things she'd never wanted to learn. The rifle was already loaded 6 shots plus 1 in the chamber if she was lucky. Not enough to fight off Gant's entire force, but perhaps enough to make them think twice about taking her alive. Perhaps enough to ensure that if her children couldn't live free, they wouldn't live as slaves. She positioned herself at the narrow entrance to their sanctuary, the rifle steady in her hands, despite exhaustion that seemed to seep into her very bones. When Gant's men found them, they'd have to come through single file, giving her every advantage the terrain could provide. She might not be a warrior by training, but she was a mother protecting her young. And that made her more dangerous than any soldier who'd ever lived. The first face appeared at the crack in the rocks, just as dawn was breaking over the canyon rim. Sarah recognized him, Pete Marlowe, who worked part-time for Gant and spent his earnings on rot-gut whiskey and loose women. His eyes widened when he saw her rifle pointed at his chest with unwavering determination. "Now, Mrs. Mitchell," he said in the placating tone men used when they thought women were being hysterical, "don't do anything foolish. We're just here to help to get you and those babies the care you need." "Help yourselves to my children, you mean?" Sarah replied, her voice steady as bedrock. "Those babies need proper care, medical attention. You're in no condition to—" Sarah's rifle spoke once, and Pete Marlowe learned what proper care really meant. His body blocked the entrance for precious seconds, while his companions tried to figure out what had happened, giving Sarah time to work the bolt and prepare for the next target. Gant's voice echoed off the canyon walls, amplified by stone, into the voice of an angry god. "Mrs. Mitchell, you've just committed murder in front of witnesses. Surrender now, and I'll make sure you get a fair trial." Sarah laughed a sound with no humor in it, sharp as breaking glass in winter wind. "Like the fair trial you gave those people in the canyon. Like the fair deal you offered my children. You're hysterical, woman. The Indian has filled your head with savage notions, turned you against your own kind." Another man tried to squeeze through the entrance, probably thinking that a hysterical woman couldn't possibly be an accurate shot. Sarah's second shot sent him tumbling back into his companions, clutching a shattered shoulder and screaming like a wounded animal. "I'm thinking clearly for the first time since my husband died." She called back, working the bolt again, with movements that were becoming automatic. "I see exactly what you are, Willard Gant." But even as she spoke, Sarah knew her position was hopeless. They could wait her out, starve her into submission, or simply bring enough men to overwhelm her defenses through sheer numbers. She had maybe 5 shots left, and there were at least a dozen enemies outside. That's when she heard the voice she'd thought never to hear again, carrying across the canyon like salvation itself. "Mr. Gant, by order of the United States Army, you are under arrest for conspiracy murder and trafficking in human beings." Captain Harper's voice, strong and clear and utterly implacable. Sarah peered through another crack in the rocks and saw him emerging from cover like an avenging angel, his uniform torn, but his bearing unmistakably military. Behind him came a dozen soldiers, real soldiers with the look of men who'd seen serious fighting and weren't impressed by civilian posturing. Gant's posse suddenly found themselves outnumbered and outgunned by professional warriors who took a dim view of child-stealing civilians operating under false colors. "Captain Harper." Gant's voice had lost its confident tone, replaced by the shrill panic of a man who suddenly realizes his victims might have friends. "Thank God you're here. The woman has gone mad, killed poor Pete Marlowe in cold blood. After you ordered him to kidnap her children." Harper replied calmly, his rifle trained on Gant with rock-steady aim. "Yes, I know all about your operation, Gant. Amazing what men will confess when they're facing court-martial for following illegal orders. Harper stepped closer to the canyon entrance, his hands empty and visible, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Mrs. Mitchell, it's Captain Harper. You and your children are safe now. Mr. Gant and his associates are under military arrest, and they'll face justice for their crimes." Sarah didn't lower her rifle. Immediately, trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. "How do I know this isn't another trick?" "Because I'm giving you my word as an officer and a father." Harper replied, his voice carrying a broken honesty that couldn't be faked. "Because my Emily would haunt me forever if I let harm come to your babies." There was something in his voice, a depth of pain and determination, that spoke of genuine change, of a man who'd looked into the abyss of his own actions and chosen to step back from the edge. Sarah slowly lowered her weapon and emerged from the hidden canyon, her surviving children in her arms. The sight that greeted her was justice, long delayed, but finally arriving. Gant and his men were on their knees, hands bound behind their backs with military efficiency, while Harper's soldiers stood guard with loaded rifles. The banker's soft face was purple with rage and pain from his wounded arm. But he was no longer in control of anything. "This is illegal." He sputtered, blood and spittle flying from his lips. "You have no authority over civilian matters." "I have authority over anything that involves my command." Harper replied with the calm of absolute certainty. "And since you've been using military resources to support your criminal enterprise, this very much involves my command." He turned to Sarah, his scarred face gentler than she'd thought possible. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology that can never be sufficient. I've been used as a tool by this man, and innocent people died because of my blindness. But I promise you, he'll face justice for what he's done, and you'll never have to fear him again." Sarah looked past him to where Tabe was finally stirring consciousness, returning slowly like dawn, breaking over distant mountains. "What happens now?" "Now Mr. Gant faces military tribunal for his crimes. His assets will be seized to compensate his victims, including the debt he held over your property. You're free, Mrs. Mitchell, free to go wherever you choose to build whatever life you can imagine." Sarah looked around at the vast landscape of stone and sky, at the man who'd saved her life, at the cost of his own people's blood, at the children she'd carried through hell to keep them safe. "I don't know where to go. I don't have anywhere left to call home." Tabe struggled to his feet, leaning heavily against the canyon wall, but managing to stand through sheer force of will. When he spoke, his voice was stronger than she'd expected. "There is always somewhere for those brave enough to build it. The question is whether you have the courage to find it." 1 year later, Sarah Mitchell stood on the porch of a small cabin overlooking a green valley where horses grazed peacefully in morning sunlight. The cabin was simple, but solid, built by hands that understood both strength and beauty, designed to shelter a family that had been forged in fire and tempered by loss. Behind her, 2 healthy children played on a blanket spread across the wooden floor. Thomas and James thriving, despite everything they'd endured, their laughter bright as coins thrown into sunlight. They were learning to speak both English and Comanche, growing up in a world where 2 cultures met and mingled instead of destroying each other. Mary's grave was under a cottonwood tree beside the creek, marked by a stone Tabe had carved with symbols that meant "beloved daughter" in his language. Sarah visited it every day, sometimes to weep, sometimes just to tell her lost child about the life they were building in her memory. The valley was part of a reservation established by treaty, one of the few agreements the government had actually honored, largely because Captain Harper had used his influence to ensure fair terms. It wasn't large, but it was theirs, a place where Comanche traditions could survive alongside new ways of living, where children of different colors could grow up together without learning to hate. Sarah taught school in the small town 15 miles away, riding back and forth each day on a pinto mare that Tabe had trained specifically for her. The work was challenging but rewarding, and the pay was enough to keep her small family fed and clothed with dignity. More importantly, it gave her purpose beyond mere survival, the chance to shape young minds that would inherit the world she was helping to build. The arrangement wasn't permanent. Nothing ever was on the frontier. But it was working day by day, season by season, building something new from the ruins of what had been destroyed. Sarah had learned to live with uncertainty, to find strength in the simple act of continuing to exist and create meaning from chaos. Tabe emerged from the cabin behind her, carrying a cup of coffee that steamed in the cool morning air. He'd taken to wearing a mixture of traditional and white man's clothing, buckskin leggings, under a cotton shirt, his hair braided with silver bands Sarah had given him for his birthday. The scars from his wounds had healed into thin white lines that spoke of survival rather than defeat. "The children are asking for breakfast," he said quietly, setting the coffee cup beside her on the porch rail. "Let them ask a little longer," Sarah replied with a smile. "It's good for them to want things to understand, that patience brings better rewards than demands." He smiled in return, something he did more often now, though the sadness never completely left his eyes. Some wounds were too deep to heal completely, but they could be lived with, incorporated into the fabric of a life that chose meaning over despair. "You sound like Grandmother Sakima," Tab observed. She used to say that hunger was the best seasoning for any meal, and waiting the finest preparation for joy. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher above the mountains that ringed their valley like protective arms. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried hunting call or territorial warning, impossible to tell from the sound alone, but beautiful either way. Captain Harper sent another letter, Tabe said, eventually pulling the envelope from his shirt pocket. "What does he say this time?" Gant was sentenced to 20 years in military prison. His network was larger than anyone suspected. Children sold from Texas to California, families destroyed to feed the appetites of people with money and no conscience. Sarah nodded, feeling no satisfaction in the news. Justice served was still justice delayed, and it couldn't resurrect the dead or heal all the wounds that had been inflicted. But it was something, a recognition that actions had consequences, that evil would eventually face judgment. "Harper also says he's retiring from the Army," Tabe continued. "Going back to Ohio, to the farm where he grew up. He wants to try growing corn instead of harvesting corpses, as he puts it." Good for him. Everyone deserves the chance to choose life over death, even if it takes them years to find the courage. He asked if we thought Emily would approve of his choice. Sarah considered this seriously, thinking of the little girl whose memory had sparked Harper's transformation from killer to protector. "I think any child would want their father to choose life over death," she said finally. "Even if it's too late to save them, it's never too late to save someone else. That's what love really means, making the world better for children we'll never meet." Behind them, Thomas started crying. Not distress, just the imperious demand of a healthy child who wanted attention and wasn't ashamed to ask for it. Sarah turned to go to him, but Tabe caught her arm gently. "There is something else," Harper wrote. "Something the Army investigators discovered during Gant's trial." Sarah waited, sensing from his tone that this news would be different from the rest. "The storm that destroyed your homestead. It was not natural." "What do you mean?" Gant had men working the area for months, using dynamite to shift sand dunes, create artificial weather patterns. The timing was not coincidence. He knew exactly when and where it would strike, had planned for you to be helpless and desperate when he arrived with his offer of help. The words hit Sarah like physical blows, each revelation adding weight to the burden of understanding she carried. Gant hadn't just taken advantage of the storm. He'd created it with the calculating precision of an engineer designing a bridge. Mary's death, the destruction of her home, the desperate flight across the desert, all of it had been orchestrated by a man who viewed other people's suffering as business opportunities to be exploited. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because you deserve to know the truth, no matter how painful," Tabe replied. Because secrets fester like untreated wounds, poisoning everything they touch. Because we honor the dead by understanding how they died, and the living by refusing to let their deaths be meaningless. Sarah looked out across the peaceful valley, trying to reconcile its beauty with the ugliness that had brought her here. Everything she'd built, every moment of happiness she'd found, was rooted in soil watered with innocent blood. Did that make it less real? Less valuable? Did knowledge of Gant's manipulation change the nature of the life she'd created? Does it change anything? She asked finally. Does knowing the truth change how you feel about this place, about the choice you made to stay? Tabe considered the question with the same seriousness she'd given it, understanding that some answers carried the weight of entire lives. No, he said at last. It changes nothing that matters. We are still here. The children are still alive and growing strong. You still chose to trust a stranger when trust was dangerous, and I still chose to help someone who needed protection. Those choices matter more than Gant's plans, more than the evil that brought us together. Sarah nodded slowly, feeling a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying begin to lift from her shoulders. Grandmother Sakima used to say something about that, didn't she? She said the wind doesn't choose which seeds it carries, but the seeds still choose where to take root. She said we cannot control the storms that scatter us, but we can control how we grow in whatever soil we find. Thomas's crying grew more insistent, joined now by James's sleepy complaints about the delay in breakfast service. Sarah laughed, the first truly free laugh she'd enjoyed since James died, and headed inside to tend to her children. As she prepared their morning meal, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd lost a husband, a daughter, a home, and nearly everything she'd thought defined her identity. But she'd also found strength she didn't know she possessed, love in the most unlikely places, and the courage to build something new from the ashes of what had been destroyed. The world was still dangerous, still filled with people like Gant, who saw others as resources to be exploited. But it was also filled with people like Tabe and Harper, who could choose mercy over revenge, love over hatred, hope over despair. And perhaps that was enough, perhaps that small flame of decency, carefully tended and fiercely protected, could eventually drive back the darkness that threatened to consume everything good in the world. Sarah Mitchell had learned many things in her 29 years, but the most important lesson was this, that love was stronger than hate, that courage could triumph over cruelty, and that sometimes the seeds scattered by the worst storms could grow into the most beautiful gardens. As she fed her children breakfast in their small cabin, overlooking a valley where different peoples had learned to live in peace, Sarah allowed herself to believe that the future might be brighter than the past. It wouldn't be easy, nothing worthwhile ever was, but it would be theirs to shape one choice at a time. One day at a time, one act of love and courage at a time. The desert stars that had fallen from the storm sky had indeed brought great change, just as Grandmother Sakima had prophesied. Whether that change proved to be good or bad would depend on the choices made by those who remained on their willingness to choose hope over despair, forgiveness over vengeance, love over fear. Sarah Mitchell was ready to make those choices, to spend whatever years remained to her, building a world where children of all colors could grow up safe and loved. It was the least she could do for Mary's memory, the best she could do for Thomas and James's future, and perhaps the only way to make sense of all the pain and loss that had brought her to this moment of unexpected grace. The sun continued its climb toward noon, casting long shadows that would gradually shorten as the day progressed. But for now, in this moment, Sarah was content to listen to her children's laughter, to share quiet conversation with a man who'd become far more than a protector, and to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. After all, if 3 stars could fall from the sky and survive to shine again, anything was possible.